News Corp papers unveiled a bold new editorial position this morning with a 16-page wraparound urging action on climate change. Yep, you heard that right.
How the world's racing to save the planet.
Vic power plant worker backs change from coal.
How much solar panels will save you?
Getting Australia to a net zero future.
Hello, I'm Paul Barry. Welcome to Media Watch. And News Corp calls its climate campaign the biggest editorial project in a decade. We reckon it's an all-time media backflip. And tonight we're devoting an entire programme to the dramatic U-turn because we think Australia's biggest media group's position on climate change has been reckless, dishonest and damaging and has paralysed the debate for decades. The big question will be, is it for real?
Climate of change.
How we can go green and save jobs in a net zero world.
Green and gold.
How Australia could be #1 in the new global economy.
It is amazing stuff, and we welcome it. Pages and pages of tips and explainers about the opportunities for Australia. But you have to marvel at the audacity of it, because this positive campaign comes after years of resistance and with a cynical refusal to accept it is a massive about-turn.
Now, this sounds like a bit of a switch for News Corp. Is that fair to say?
Oh, not really, Ben. I think what it's fair to say is we probably haven't covered it to this extent ever before. And I think that perhaps wrongly, our position on the climate issue has been characterised by the views of some of our columnists.
But Telegraph editor Ben English should try telling that to his readers, many of whom reacted to this brave new green world by spitting out their cornflakes.
What happened to this paper today? I feel like I'm reading the ABC website with all these climate change stories. No thanks.
Wow, Daily Telegraph. Really getting on the wacko lefty climate change bandwagon today.
A load of alarmist rubbish. Is this the Herald Sun or the Age?
And on Monday night, News Corp's loudest columnist, Andrew Bolt, was equally alarmed, calling the campaign
16 pages of News Corp's global warming propaganda
and dubbing it an extraordinary about-face.
Because most of these same newspapers campaigned against Kevin Rudd's global warming policies and against Labor's later carbon tax and against Labor's global warming policies of the last election, and also mocked global warming extremes from Rudd to Greta Thunberg. And now this gets rubbish. I don't buy it.
Bolt then held up his hometown Herald Sun and picked apart the stories on reefs and Thatcher, cyclones and droughts before throwing up his hands and admitting defeat.
I know I've lost the argument. My whole company's against me. I know that. Against these huge players, all the big political parties, my own employer, all the media, big media outlets. What am I? I'm just someone on the sidelines. Someone just howling on the sidelines. But telling you the truth.
Sky's Peter Credlin, once Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister who killed the carbon tax, expressed similar outrage in The Australian, only making Morrison, not News Corp, the target, and asking,
how can something be dead wrong 2 years ago, but now be absolutely right?
And the answer? Well, it was wrong 2 years ago, just as it was 10 years ago. And by the end, News Corp and its columnists were almost alone in refusing to see what was right. So what has forced the company into this dramatic change? Well, some of the biggest Australian advertisers, like Coles, Woolies, Wesfarmers, Toyota and the big banks, are all pushing for net zero by 2050. And to keep them happy, News Corp needs to fall into line. But the rest of the world is also moving on and forcing change. As ABC News reported last week,
Australia's Deputy Reserve Bank Governor is warning foreign investors could start pulling money out of Australia in favour of greener alternatives.
And New South Wales Treasurer Matt Keane made a similar point last week in launching the state's $3 billion green hydrogen strategy, warning that global markets are already threatening the livelihood of Australia's coal miners.
The first thing that we need to understand is that those jobs are not going to be impacted by domestic policymakers. They're going to be determined by changes in international markets, and that's exactly what's happening. So putting your fingers in your ears and head in the sand and hoping it'll go away is not the solution.
Thus has News Corp been forced to take its head out of the sand as well, with the Australian's political editor Simon Benson declaring,
the train is leaving the station, and it is leaving whether everyone is on board or not.
And Joe Hildebrand, who's the happy, smiling face of the News Corp campaign, was busy spinning the same line, that it's time.
hang on a minute, we're going to get left behind if we don't act on this.
Joe was talking about Australia, but the same is true of his own employer, as Seven's Angela Cox pointed out.
This is a massive campaign by News Corp. You guys very influential. Bit of a change of tune, trying to save the planet on climate change.
No doubt Joe's being handsomely paid for his spinning, and just as well, because on 2GB he told Jim Wilson that everyone else in Australia had failed to deliver on climate policy, and it was time to leave it to the adults at News Corp.
And so we just basically had to come in and say, all right, well, you've all had a turn. Time for the grown-ups to take over. And we've just said, you know what, let's just take all the politics out of it, strip out all the politics, all the vendetta.
That, Joe, is shockingly dishonest, because it was News Corp's grown-ups who gave us the politics and vendetta, with headlines like this.
Carbon collapse. Firm fails every hour as energy prices soar.
Carbon zombies! Shortened to bring failed green tax back from the dead.
Horror show. 3 years after rejecting Labor's carbon tax, the dreaded nightmare returns.
Voters wake in fright.
And it was also News Corp's grown-ups who helped Australia fail. News Corp campaigned against a carbon tax in 2008 when Kevin Rudd first proposed it. It then attacked Julia Gillard and her emissions reduction scheme even harder. And when Tony Abbott killed it all off in 2014, this was the telly's jubilant front page.
After 747 days of economy-stifling misery.
Tax bites the dust.
Illegitimate love child of Julia Gillard and Bob Brown, birthed from a lie.
But apart from news.com.au, almost all News Corp's key mastheads have been casting doubt on climate science or the need for action for decades. In 2010, UNSW's David McKnight examined the group's coverage between 1997 and 2007 and concluded,
newspapers and television stations owned by News Corporation, based on their editorials, columnists and commentators, largely denied the science of climate change and dismissed those who were concerned about it. Its corporate view framed the issue as one of political correctness rather than science.
In 2011, Robert Mann's quarterly essay, Bad News, focused on the Australians' climate coverage since 2000, and it found
its editorials welcomed the anti-climate science challenges, both of unqualified scientists and totally unqualified laypeople, and consistently denied that the science was settled.
And that same year, Wendy Bacon at UTS reached similar conclusions. And last year, in a new study, found little had changed. As Junkie reported,
a new report shows that over the last 12 months, following the Black Summer bushfires, nearly half of all climate coverage in 4 News Corp publications cast doubt on or completely rejected climate science. The Daily Telegraph was the worst, with 58% of its pieces on climate change being negative.
To push home its do-nothing message, News Corp and its columnists have used a variety of arguments. That climate change is great, that the science isn't settled, that it's all just alarmism, and even a socialist plot. They've also insisted global warming has nothing to do with droughts and nothing to do with bushfires, and that the barrier reef is not really in danger. News Corp's commentators have also told us it's pointless taking action because, as Terry McCrann put it in the Herald Sun in 2019,
Nothing the Australian government can do can make the slightest difference to the climate. We are just too small.
And they have consistently argued that renewable energy is too expensive. In fact, it's now cheaper, and beset by problems because it's no good when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Or as the Australian's former leader writer Chris Kenny put it on Sky,
we've always said that renewables are nice if they work, but they're expensive, unreliable, impractical, and frankly, a bit of a con.
So, if Australia did take action to radically reduce emissions, News Corp told us we'd get regular blackouts and soaring power bills, while Australians would lose their jobs and it would cost taxpayers a fortune.
$60 billion.
That's how much extra Labor's carbon policy will cost our economy.
Or, if you preferred an earlier calculation, it would be 10 times as much.
ALP's $600 billion carbon bill.
Power bills up 78%. Thousands of jobs lost. Economic growth shattered.
Well, happily, you can now wave goodbye to all that, because with the change in News Corp's editorial direction, the sun will shine and the money will flood in. On behalf of his bosses, Joe Hildebrand assures us Mission Zero will make Australia fabulously rich.
We're looking at eye-watering sums of like $2.1 trillion by 2050 and something along the lines of 670,000 new jobs.
Woohoo! So, how come News Corp hasn't pushed for this bonanza before? Last Monday's campaign opener noted, with no sense of shame, that Margaret Thatcher sounded the alarm on global warming more than 3 decades ago.
The former British PM, with a background in chemistry, understood the science of climate change and tried to warn the world of the peril ahead if nothing was done to address it.
Sadly, News Corp wasn't listening at the time, or for the next 31 years. But now, finally, it's endorsing what the science and the scientists are telling us. The world is getting hotter, glaciers are melting, bushfires are becoming more frequent and severe, droughts are getting worse and more widespread, and the Great Barrier Reef has suffered 3 mass bleaching events in the last 5 years. And it's even given us a dire warning from the Climate Council's Will Steffen.
With increasing fires, floods and extreme heat, the climate system is on the verge of getting out of control. The risk of not getting on top of this is enormous. It's almost existential.
That's the same Professor Steffen who called for urgent political and economic action on emissions in Nature magazine 2 years ago, only to be immediately rubbished by News Corp's Peter Credlin for being an activist academic.
Let's be clear, this is not science, but advocacy dressed up as science. And just because someone has professor in his title doesn't mean he's not pushing a barrow. The Nature editorial even more or less owns up to being part of a campaign.
Also leading News Corp's dramatic U-turn is Dr. Alan Finkel, the scientist who authored a landmark report on energy policy for the Turnbull government in 2017. As the telly told us last week,
Dr. Alan Finkel is the nation's leading figure in our response to the climate change challenge. There is no one more expert, more influential or more well-balanced to answer questions on climate change and our national response.
Yet back in 2017, the Telegraph's Piers Ackerman had a slightly different take on his work and talent.
The Finkel report is a blueprint for destruction of the Australian economy and destruction of the Liberal Party. His report fails at every level. The claims that are made in his name just don't stand up.
If it wasn't so serious, this hypocrisy would be hilarious. But in fact, News Corp has helped delay real action on climate change for well over a decade. We asked News Corp to comment on that, as well as a series of other questions, but we did not get a reply. So, will the future really be different? One former News Corp executive told me to watch cynically.
It will just be a 2-week campaign. It won't affect future coverage. Editors will continue to take their own line on what climate change stories they run.
And the same executive predicted News Corp will not be sacking or muzzling its commentators, saying,
"No, it'll just let them run."
Several climate change campaigners have also dismissed the News Corp campaign as greenwashing. But others see it as a tectonic shift, and we think they're right, at least as far as News Corp's tabloids are concerned. Having backflipped once, they surely can't do it again. And if they do monster Labor in the next election, it will surely have to be on something else. Writing in the 9 newspapers, the Australian's former political reporter David Crowe called News Corp's repositioning significant and a political development with impact, explaining that now
Morrison can cajole Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce into accepting net zero by 2050 in the knowledge the country's biggest newspaper publisher will not campaign against the target.
And on ABC Radio, former PM Malcolm Turnbull took a similar view of the significance.
This gives Scott Morrison licence to make a move. You know, the anti-climate action coalition in Australia has been for years a combination of vested interests in the fossil fuel sector, gas and coal, the right-wing politics in the Liberal and National parties and their supporters, and the Murdoch press. And so what you're seeing is, at the very least, a shift in part of the Murdoch press. And the message that is being sent to Morrison is to say, if you move, the Murdoch tabloids will not come after you.
If that's true, this is a historic change, which could transform the way Australia's climate policy is made. But what about all those noisy columnists who have done so much to shape News Corp's position in the past? Will they keep shouting the odds? To judge by last week's reaction, their answer is yes.
Net zero by 2050 is a glib line, a slogan, a fashionable and vacuous promise.
By making our nation poorer and our energy security here more precarious, one of the most volatile times in our history, well, to me, that just defies common sense.
We are a world superpower in fossil fuels. We should be proud of it and market it to the world.
Those columnists get their platform with The Australian and Sky News, which rely less on ads than the tabloids do. And strident opinion helps sell subscriptions. But even if the chorus continues at full volume, and we reckon it will quieten down, the sceptics will be reduced to howling on the sidelines, as Andrew Bolt so eloquently put it. Or in the words of The Australian's political editor Simon Benson, they will be stranded shouting at the station after the train has departed. That's all from us tonight. There's more on our website where you can read transcripts and download the programme. And don't forget Media Bites every Thursday online. But for now, until next week, goodbye.